When I was younger, like many others, I loved to watch television. I know that's not an experience unique to myself, but it was truly my favorite thing to do. Undoubtedly, my favorite channel in my younger years was Noggin. I would always be so excited to come home from school and turn on the TV so I could enjoy the last couple of hours of my favorite shows before it switched to the N at 6. I loved Moose Moose and ZD Bird, and I absolutely adored all of the little skits and songs they would put on in between the shows. Truthfully, I mainly watched Noggin just so I could see them. I was pretty impartial to the actual TV shows that would air on the channel. I remember how disappointed I would be when the sign-off sequence would begin just before dinner time, despite the fact that Done Day was a favorite song of mine. Though I was bummed that my Noggin viewing was coming to an end, I would sit in front of the TV in my living room, singing along until it was time to turn it off. I was in kindergarten when my Noggin fixation was at its peak, so I wasn't allowed to watch TV past 6 o'clock anyway. When I complained about this to my parents, they told me that only the mature shows aired past that time and that Moose Moose and ZD Bird would be back the next day. When I asked them if I could watch a little bit of the N just so I could see what it was, they told me that the shows they aired were too scary for children and that it would likely give me nightmares. Being a child who was spooked easily, I decided to take their word for it and just find something else to do. My mom was a nurse and she usually came home around 6 on the nights that she worked. Occasionally, she would have to pick up overtime, so there were some nights she would come home a couple of hours later. My dad, however, would already be home, as he started work early in the morning and ended his days early into the evening. I remember one particular day in November of 2007. My mother happened to be working later than usual, which again was completely normal for her job. My dad also happened to have started work a bit earlier in the morning than he usually did, as he was a bricklayer whose hours could vary slightly. Because of this, he would sometimes fall asleep on the couch not long after coming home from work. This day was no exception. On this night, I remember sitting in the living room watching Noggin just as I usually had done. My dad had been sitting on the couch behind me, but I noticed just before it was time to turn the TV off that he had fallen asleep. Silly Dad, I thought. However, this had given me what I thought was a brilliant idea. In my house, there was a television in the basement as well that was connected to cable. It was what my dad used on nights when he would invite his work friends over to watch whatever big sports events were going on. Even though my parents were usually the ones to turn on the television for me, I memorized which channel number Noggin was. I had just celebrated my first Halloween without crying, so I felt braver than ever. This newfound bravery inspired a new curiosity inside of me as to what the N was really about and why my parents had kept it from me all this time. My plan was that at approximately 5:45, I would switch off the TV in my living room in case my dad woke up and noticed that I had neglected to turn it off, as I had always been instructed to do. This would give me enough time to head to the basement and turn on that TV so that I could avoid being caught past my allotted watch time. So that is exactly what I did. I made sure to shut the basement door behind me and tiptoe down the stairs as quietly as possible. I had to fish my little hands between the couch cushions to find the remote, but I was successfully able to turn the television on once I did. When the screen lit up, my little fingers pressed 258 on the remote. Just as I had thought, the channel switched over to Noggin, and with little time to spare. The show, Max and Ruby, was currently airing. Just as I had switched to the channel, I could see Max and Ruby standing side by side, waving to the audience as the screen faded to black. I then heard the whistling of Done Day and knew that my mission would be successful. "We're gonna say goodbye to the trees and bees," Moose sang, as I nestled down into my couch full of anticipation. Despite the fact that I was much braver now, I still couldn't shake the subtle feeling of anxiety that was tugging at me. It was a fun day, but now it's a done day. My legs began to bounce on the floor as I could hardly contain my excitement any longer. The screen faded to black as the final line was played. I used my noggin today. I glanced over to the digital clock that was sitting right next to the screen, which read 6 o'clock. The screen remained black for another moment, and then another moment, until eventually the clock read 6:01. I thought it was odd that it would take this long for the channel to switch over, but I figured it was so the other moms and dads could have a bit of time to turn it off before their children saw anything frightening. 6:03, the clock read, as I continued to sit in utter anticipation. I was starting to wonder if maybe there was something wrong with my TV or if my parents had somehow set up a channel blocker that set into place after noggin ended. Just as I was growing impatient, a low humming sound started to emit from the speakers. That's odd, I thought. I had never heard the television make this sound before. The humming noise continued for another 30 seconds before the screen started to fade into something I could hardly make out at an excruciatingly slow speed. Eventually, I was able to make out what the channel was playing, staticky as it still was. It was none other than Moose A. Moose once again. But as the screen continued to slowly fade into his picture, the colors became more and more saturated. The humming sound increased, but I figured that perhaps the channel was having an issue connecting. "Are you ready?" An excited voice echoed through the TV. For some reason, the opening sequence of Noggin began to play. The difference was that, strangely, the audio was extremely distorted, so much so that it hardly sounded like Moose's voice at all. This made me feel slightly unsettled, as I knew the sign-on song didn't play until 6 in the morning. The crunchy audio continued to play through my speakers while Moose and Z expressed their excitement for the coming day. But as the song was about to end, something unusual happened. Just as Moose sang, "I'm using my noggin today," the screen seemed to freeze, and the final chord of the ukulele started to repeat in a glitchy fashion. As it repeated, the colors of the screen gradually became even more saturated than before, with an increasingly pixelated appearance. Moose's face became so obstructed that I couldn't even make out what was on the screen anymore. After what felt like an eternity of witnessing this disturbing distortion, the audio stopped playing altogether. In place of Moose's eyes, a pair of bloodshot, human-like eyes appeared on the screen and slowly blinked. When they reopened, the whites of the eyes had turned completely red. Suddenly, the screen cut to black, though the humming sound continued. I was frozen on the couch in fear. Though I had never seen anything truly terrifying in my life, I knew enough to realize that this was far from normal. The darkness of the screen persisted for a few more moments until it once again cut to something different. The image depicted was much clearer than what had been previously shown, and I almost wished it hadn't been. Sitting on the hardwood floor of a kitchen was a little girl who couldn't have been much older than 3. She had bright blue eyes and little blonde pigtails tied up with pink scrunchies. She wore a pink gingham dress that reached halfway down her calves and frilly white socks that looked almost whimsical. In her hands was a little doll dressed identically to her, with the same beautiful blue eyes and bouncy pigtails. The little girl hugged the doll close to her chest, rocking it back and forth as she softly hummed, "Mary had a little lamb." This scene played out for much longer than felt comfortable, if comfort was something I was even capable of feeling at that moment. Suddenly, the girl put the doll down and stared directly into the camera. Unblinking, she stared and stared until, suddenly, her pupils began to expand. They grew past her irises and into the whites of her eyes, until
And that's it for tonight's story. But don't worry, the darkness always has more tales to tell. If you enjoyed this, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next chilling episode. I've got something really special planned for next time. And trust me, you won't want to face it alone. So, stay tuned. And until then, keep your lights on and your doors locked.